Kurt Wolfe, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Bruce. Glad to be here.
So I'm here with Kurt Wolfe. He's a partner at Quinn Emanuel in Washington, D.C. Congrats on that, Kurt. His
Thanks.
practice focuses on SEC enforcement, and many of you also know him as the co-host of the inSecurities podcast, which has covered all things in the field of securities regulation, along with his co-host, Chris Eckimoff of RSM. inSecurities had a really nice 5-year run from January 2020 until the series finale, which was this month, earlier this month. But Kurt, 138 episodes with everyone from authors to academics to practitioners to the chairman of the SEC as guests. Congrats and thanks for 5 years of great episodes and great insights.
Yeah, thanks. It was a ton of fun. I've always said it was sort of a labor of love, right? I mean, a lot of work goes into every single episode of the podcast, from planning the episodes and finding the guests and doing the production stuff on the back end. But we were always really proud to put out what we hope was a helpful listen for folks, whether they're on their way to work or on the metro or wherever they may be. But we loved doing it, and I have to say the response or the feedback that we've gotten since announcing that we were going to wind it down has been pretty overwhelming. So, thank you to everyone that listened, and I hope you enjoyed it over the last 5 years.
You've gotten a lot of sad texts and emails trying to get you
Yeah,
back.
exactly. A lot of sad emojis on LinkedIn.
Well, that's great. Thank you. Um, I know up front this is a self-serving question, but Kurt, tell us how you and Chris met and how you ended up doing the podcast together.
So I think we've told this story a couple of times, but I'm guessing everybody who listens to this podcast won't know. We actually met at what I believe was the very first ever securities enforcement forum in DC years ago. What year was that, Bruce? When was the first
Well,
one?
the first was in 2012, but I think you guys were a few years after that. I mean, unless you met and then 5 years later decided to do it.
No, we did. So that's the interesting part. There was like this little window of time where we were getting to know each other. It was like the dating phase of our relationship. So we met at the first ever securities enforcement forum. I think when you gave your opening remarks that year, you said we're going to be putting some things up on Twitter and on LinkedIn. Use the hashtag. I think it was like SEF 2012 or something at the time, right? So Chris and I started tweeting about the securities enforcement forum and found each other during the course of the day because there weren't that many people tweeting at the
And
time.
there still aren't.
There have been some years where it's been really, really busy. That first year it was not, and so we found each other eventually. Our respective bosses at the time made fun of us for tweeting from a securities conference, but we just struck up a friendship. We started having lunch, at least once a quarter at Smith and Walensky on K Street. Very, very swanky. And a few years later, he came to me and said, "Listen, I have this potential opportunity to do a podcast with the Practicing Law Institute, PLI. Would you be interested in doing something like that with me? Since we tend to just sit around and talk about this stuff anyway." And we were off to the races.
That's great. I never knew that until I attended your 100th episode party and you told me that story, and I had no idea. I thought that was cool. Felt
Yeah.
like it was like It's a Wonderful Life. Like if I hadn't lived, then maybe you wouldn't have had your podcast.
Yeah. Well, I guess we were right at the end that something good could come from all that tweeting. But
Yeah.
there was some considerable questions about it from our bosses at the time.
Well, looking back, Kurt, what major takeaways do you have from your experience doing that podcast for 5 years?
Yeah, I think one of them is you just have to be sort of relentless. I mean, I think after 5 or 6 episodes, we could have said, listen, we're not getting a ton of traction, which we weren't after the first couple of episodes. It was brand new. And actually, I think 4 episodes in maybe is when COVID hit and everybody went into lockdown. So maybe the easy thing would have been to say, listen, this was a good idea, but it's just not working. And instead, we decided to just press through. And we were fortunate to have a fantastic early guest, then SEC Commissioner Robert Jackson, who our good buddy JW Verrett introduced us to, came on. And at that point, we sort of pivoted to a different style of show, more of an interview show. And I think that would be my second point. You got to be relentless, but two, you've got to kind of pivot and figure out what works and what people are interested in. And I think it was the interviews that really caused our listenership to start ticking up, the downloads to start ticking up. Because now when I look back over the past 5 years, we've had, every sitting SEC commissioner. We had Chair Gensler. I mean, now that, Commissioner Ueda has been named the acting chair. That's another chair that was on the list.
That
We even had
counts. That
Caroline.
counts.
Yeah, that counts, right? We had Caroline Pham from the CFTC, who's now the acting chair over there. So I think getting to hear from people like that in something that's a little bit more informal than just a speech on stage, I think folks really reacted well to that. And
Yeah.
I think it was that early pivot though that made the difference.
Yeah, I found that to be true with the conferences, right? Like you can either have someone up kind of reading remarks, prepared remarks, or you can have like a one-on-one Q&A. I always find the Q&A to be more interesting,
Yeah,
personally.
I agree. And actually, I mean, you've pivoted yourself a little bit in that sense over the last few years of SEF to more like fireside chats with the keynote. And I think people have
Yeah.
responded really, really well to it. I love it personally.
Yeah, so do I. So do you have an all-time favorite episode before we move on to our 2024 year in review?
It would be really, really difficult to choose. I mean, a couple jump out. We had some really good conversations with Commissioner Hester Peirce, and there was one where we were joking about some of the names of her speeches. I loved that one. I love when we did some things outside of the box. Like we had an episode where we had a bunch of law students on during the pandemic to talk about how they were thinking about finding that first job. We did one where we talked about FINRA arbitrations, and we brought in some law school professors to talk about the clinics that they run, right? So, I mean, it was like week in and week out, you were getting kind of the regular diet of securities regulation and enforcement. And so just to the extent that it was a little bit different and I found it personally interesting, I loved some of those other episodes.
That's great. Well, again, thank you and a great run.
It was our pleasure.
A great
Absolutely.
run. So I was planning to do a 2024 year in review, and I was going to do it, just sit down and do it. And I thought, like, it would be so much more fun to do it with somebody like who else has been following this stuff all year
Yeah.
round. And you were the first one who came to mind, and really appreciate you joining me. So we're going to go through some categories, some kind of lighthearted, some more serious. But so for our 2024 year in review, category one, what was the most amusing quote or development of the year?
So I'm going to go with quote only because I've already mentioned, I love talking with Commissioner Peirce about her speeches on insecurities. She had another couple really good ones over the course of 2024, but there was one that really jumped out for me. So I'll share that quote. It was actually a joint statement with Commissioner now acting Chair Ueda and Commissioner Peirce. It was called Omakase. Statement on In the Matter of Flyfish Club LLC. This is back from September, and this is just sort of like the headline quote to pull from this dissenting statement. Quote, for curmudgeonly commissioners like us, crypto enforcement feels a bit like a trip to a restaurant for a meal omakase style. Omakase translates to, I'll leave it up to you. This directive is wonderful in the hands of a renowned chef, but disastrous in the hands of a crypto-obsessed commission, leaving crypto to be addressed in an endless series of misguided and overreaching cases has been and continues to be a consequential mistake. End quote. I just remember reading that at the time and I thought, oh man, from my perspective, from our client's perspective, she nailed it. They nailed it, I should say. So that was my quote of the year.
All right. I'm going to go with not a regulator, but someone on the other side of the V. So there was a case against a guy named Jonathan Larmore. He was a real estate mogul. Both the SEC and the DOJ were going after him. And one of the uh, claims in the indictment of Larmore is he was trying to do some kind of like options buying spree, and he was bullying brokerage employees into going along with him. And when they asked him to complete the paperwork necessary to carry out these crazy option purchases, his quote was, I'm on my yacht and I don't have a printer. I thought that was solid.
That's amazing. I actually didn't know about that one. That's really, I love it.
My runner up, just as a development, was I thought it was an amazing flex by Ken Griffin, the CEO of Citadel, when he just paid $45 million at an auction for a Stegosaurus skeleton. That was very, very solid.
You just got outbid there, Bruce.
Yes. All right. What was the unexpected event of the year?
So I'll go first on this one so that you don't steal mine. Um, for me, it was the SEC's enforcement numbers. I feel like over the course of 2024, there was a lot of speculation about where they were going to land. I think a lot of folks thought it was going to be low, but in the end, it was 583 enforcement actions, which was something like a 26% dip from the year before. It was the lowest number since the financial crisis. Actually, I went to figure this out at one point, and as far back as I could find the SEC reporting their annual enforcement results, I could not find a lower number. So there were lots of reasons why that was, right? And it certainly has nothing to do with like the effort or commitment of the staff. There were impediments like jarczy, right? But it still was a pretty eye-popping number. I have to say, we talked to Kabir Graywall on the podcast about this, and he said there are a lot of reasons why it was low, and you should expect to see it tick back up. And lo and behold, just last week, I think we saw what I think is a first of its kind press release announcing that Q1, so the first quarter of fiscal year 2025 for the SEC, saw more enforcement actions than any Q1 in history. So I don't know if that's trying to make everybody feel a little bit better, but there certainly has been a bounce back. But for me, it was that initial report of that number. I just thought, wow, this was unexpectedly low.
Yeah. My unexpected event of the year was almost exactly 1 year ago. It was a day before the SEC's decision on whether to approve a Bitcoin ETF was due. And the SEC announced on its official Twitter feed that the ETF had been approved. And then Chair Gensler announced on his own Twitter feed that no, the SEC's Twitter had been hacked and the prior message was unauthorized and the SEC had not approved anything. That was my most unexpected event. Of course, the next day they did approve it, but I did not see that coming at all.
No, I had forgotten about that. And I remember at the time, talking with folks about what might have happened there. Did they schedule a tweet to go out and they hit the wrong date or, what happened? Because obviously the closeness in time makes you think they knew it
Yeah.
was coming. Well, yeah, I had forgotten about that. That was definitely unexpected.
Yep. All right. Next, your interesting discovery of the year, something you found or saw this year that you thought was interesting.
I'm going to let you take this one first, Bruce, because I feel like mine is. So what was your interesting discovery of the
Okay.
year in 2024?
So if you've attended the securities enforcement before, or if you've even been a reader of my newsletter for a while, you know that I like to collect what I call scandalware.
Hmm.
And I made that term up, but I've got my Madoff mugs, I've got my WorldCom Post-its,
Right.
I've got my Enron hat and
Yeah.
my Mossack Fonseca hat. I mean, I've got my tiny collection, but uh, I was really interested to read in July in the Wall Street Journal about this venture capital investor who had created his own failure museum with thousands of items in it. And so the Wall Street Journal described it as what might be, quote, the world's largest collection dedicated to business fiascos, corporate malfeasance, and spectacular flops.
Oh,
So basically,
wow.
he had what I had times to the 10th power. And he's got everything from a Theranos lab coat to like FTX bobbleheads to all kinds of other crazy failures, such as like cans of new Coke and a pets.com sock puppet. But it looks amazing. And if I could ever get him to bring it to the West Coast Enforcement Conference, I definitely will.
Oh, that would be incredible. You at least have to go visit, though, right? I mean, that's
Yeah,
what
I
you
think
want
it's
to
in his
spend
house,
your.
so I'm not sure he's taking any guests.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, you've got to get them to bring that out. That would be amazing, even if it was just a few things. Wow, I had no idea. I love that.
So what I will make a point to the things that we talk about, I'll put like a little link to it in the show notes. So if people want to read that article or read about the SEC Twitter hack or whatever, all of the info will be there.
Love it. Love it. Well, so mine is a little bit more, well, I'll say more work related, but maybe not. That is actually work related. But mine is relating to AI, right? So I made a joke at the Securities Enforcement Forum in the fall that it was like Gary Gensler's favorite thing to talk about over the last year, and he'd done 6 or 7 videos on AI. And of course, there have been a couple SEC enforcement actions that I'll say are AI related, maybe loosely AI related. But all of that made me start poking around a little bit and thinking, what is this? How does Chat GPT work? Are there any applications for this new technology that maybe I can use? And I found that actually there are. It's helpful to do things like, write little parts of speeches or intros. If I was looking to make a really short introductory email or a LinkedIn post, something like that. Certainly not legal research, not asking it to write my briefs by any stretch of the imagination. But I am finding that there are some applications where I can use it in my day to day. It needs some supervision and some tweaking, so it sounds like me. But if you've ever had that moment of writer's block, it's actually a pretty good tool to break through that pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's a really good one. And I need to do a lot more AI discovering in 2025. I feel like I'm still a very, very basic novice, but
Uh,
that's a really good one.
yeah, it's intimidating. I still am intimidated by it, but I'm getting Chat GPT down. We'll go from there.
Yeah. All right. What is the SEC decision or regulation of the year?
So you mentioned mine already, but I'm going to go with the SEC's decision to allow spot Bitcoin ETPs to start trading on exchange. As you mentioned, that happened last January, but to me, that was significant. That was a milestone in terms of regulation or rulemaking at the SEC, and the end of a very long and bloody fight about whether or not to let that particular kind of exchange traded product trade on exchange. Of course, there were other types of ETFs or ETPs that touched crypto or held crypto that are or were already allowed to trade. But this seemed like the dam finally broke. And after that, of course, we've seen all kinds of different Bitcoin ETPs start to come to market, or at least submit applications to trade. And the flow of money into these products has been just enormous. In fact, I read that Bitcoin ETF flows are outpacing, on an inflation adjusted basis, are outpacing the first gold ETFs over the first 6 months that they were trading, which is truly remarkable. So felt important to me. I've heard some people say like this is when Bitcoin went mainstream. That may be the case. We'll see. I don't anticipate any clamping down on that going forward. So I think the dam
Yeah,
is.
and I tried to come up with a couple for each so we wouldn't have the same one. I couldn't come up with another one that was even comparable, and I had the same as you. The approval of the Bitcoin ETP or ETF, however you want to describe it. But the other thing I thought was interesting about that was basically they needed three votes to get that, and you could say Chair Gensler was the third vote,
Yeah.
and still while approving it, he called Bitcoin, quote, primarily a speculative, volatile asset that's used for illicit activity, including ransomware, money laundering, sanction evasion, and terrorist financing, and basically said, we approved it, but we don't approve or endorse Bitcoin, and
Yep.
approved nonetheless. But quite a development, and I agree that was the decision of the year.
Yeah, I agree. The only other one I had on my list, and I'll just mention this because I think it's potentially interesting going forward, and that was Commissioner Lazarga announcing that he was going to step down effective January 17th. There are a lot of reasons for that, and I won't second guess any of those. Of course, I just think it's interesting to the extent that we are now going to find ourselves in a position for some period of time with a three-person commission, two Republicans and one Democrat, which is, I think, a little different than what you often find at this point in a transition to a new administration. It's different, for example, than what's happening at the CFTC, where they've got what looks like it'll be a 2-2 gridlock for some period of time until a new chair is named and gets through the Senate. So I just think that it leaves the SEC in a really interesting posture in the near term, and maybe one in which acting chair Ueda can actually get some things done because he has the majority.
Yeah. I saw something today. In fact, it was in the newsletter today about how having a three-person commission effectively gives the Democrat a veto over any new rulemaking because I guess according to the article, you have to have in a three-person commission, if the third person just doesn't show up or doesn't
Yes,
participate, then you can't get it done. So
that's true. Yeah,
that's actually another interesting twist on that as well.
that's absolutely true. It's a good point. So yeah, it could be interesting. Could be fun for the next several months.
Yeah. Next category, what is the case of the year for the SEC?
Hmm. I'm gonna let you go first on this one. I've got a few. So
I've got two. I'll go with my number one. I can save my backup. See, I'm just going to say Solar wins. Um, I mean, it was a fraud lawsuit. It was brought years ago, I believe, but it was decided this year. And Judge Engelmeyer in the SDNY basically granted most of the company's motion to dismiss, and kind of said like the SEC doesn't the SEC has authority over financial controls, but not all internal controls. And he kind of gave the example, if you give the SEC too sweeping authority, it could empower it to regulate background checks using hiring security guards, or the selection of what kind of padlocks you have to have, or the how much security your passwords have to have. And I just know that was such a big decision for CISOs in particular, but companies about their cyber. And I thought that was the case of the year.
yeah, I had that one on my list as well. So great minds think alike. It's interesting because when you posed this question to me initially, right? What is the SEC case of the year? My initial reaction was thinking like, what was a big victory for the SEC, right? So I thought like, is there one? And so I went back and looked at the annual enforcement report because a lot of times there will be, some headline or banner case that they'll talk about repeatedly, and I mean, there really sort of wasn't one. And what I defaulted to was actually the SEC case of the year was probably a loss. And I think they lost a lot in some fairly high profile cases last year. So we had National Association of Private Fund Managers versus the SEC back in June. The Fifth Circuit basically vacated the SEC's private fund advisor rule. Of course, SolarWinds was another loss. There were two cases actually decided in November, decided together in the Northern District of Texas, that struck down the SEC's dealer rule, which would have expanded the scope of who qualified as a broker-dealer under the Exchange Act. So to me, I think the case of the year was probably SEC losses. And we haven't even mentioned Jarkissi yet, which I'm sure we're going to talk about later.
And you also didn't mention another case that I have as my runner-up, which was, I guess, what they call the debt box case, uh, where the SEC wound up getting itself sanctioned $1.8 million in legal fees, had a couple lawyers reportedly having to resign. But it was sanctions related to what the judge called an abuse of power by the SEC in a case where they were seeking a TRO. I thought that was a pretty significant case.
Yeah, I remember that one well. It didn't get as many headlines as I might have expected, given just, that was a tough one for the SEC to take on the chin. To their credit, they did fully and, sort of apologize for the alleged conduct. But I did not have that one on my list.
Yeah. All right. What is the SEC trial of the year? And I think we're going to have the same one on this one.
I think we probably are. For me, it has to be Panawatt.
Correct.
Yeah, yeah. So that, of course, was a case in which the SEC brought this, I'll call it novel, they won't, but this novel insider trading theory called shadow trading. And it went all the way to a jury trial in which they found this individual, Mr. Panawatt, guilty of insider trading, or liable for insider trading. And it was a big deal because I think a lot of folks expected Mr. Panawatt to prevail against what I thought was sort of a little bit of a reach in interpreting sort of the scope or the breadth of the insider trading prohibitions. But it was just decided in favor of the SEC and it stuck. So in September, the same court declined Mr. Panawatt's request for a new trial or some other relief. So I think this may now be the law of the land, at least temporarily.
Yeah, I agree. That was a trial of the year and a victory for the SEC. So
Yeah, there we go. They're not all losses.
yeah, correct. All right, next one, the fraud of the year. What do you think?
So it's interesting because these kind of run into another thing we're going to talk about, which is the criminal case of the year. The big frauds tend to, I think, have a criminal element to them. But one that jumped out at me, there were these three individuals, all of whom reside in Nigeria, and I won't pronounce their names because I'm afraid that I'll say them wrong. But essentially, They were masquerading as broker-dealers and investment advisors and running this big scheme where they were fooling people into investing money, with them. The scheme went on for years, actually. They created fake websites. They used software to change their voices because they would actually call people and say, this is your broker so and so, and it was like a multi-million dollar fraud. I just thought it was really interesting because there's this intersection of technology and what I would say are kind of like classic securities law fraud cases. And I can only imagine that we're going to see more of this going forward, right? Like I was talking about how I'm thinking about using AI. On the AI panel at the Securities Enforcement Forum in the fall, a couple of the panelists were talking about how, guess what? The fraudsters are going to be able to do this too, to get sharper and get better and maybe more persuasive in their schemes. So this one to me felt like it was interesting, and it also felt like a sign of things to come. And frankly, in a commission where, I mean, I think at least some folks think enforcement could drop off a little bit in this coming administration. You can imagine these would be the kind of cases that are going to absolutely continue, right? The SEC is always going to bring these cases.
Yeah. It wasn't a year where you had like an Enron or a WorldCom or,
Right.
some massive fraud. So I was kind of going back through, and I'm going to go with the case against BF Borgers, which is, as alleged by the SEC, basically running a sham audit mill. And they
Hmm.
said, they were allegedly doing everything under the sun, copying work papers from prior previous engagements for their clients, changing the dates, then passing them off as the current work papers. I saw one commentator, I think it was the corporate law blog, that said the SEC's order, quote, reads like a litany of every SEC rule and statutory provision that an auditor could conceivably violate or cause its client to violate in connection with an audit or review engagement. So that's going to be my fraud of the year.
It's an interesting one. I remember that one when it came out. It got some buzz because the SEC will always, again, I'm thinking about what might this new commission focus on, and things like fraud involving gatekeepers. Again, that's bread and butter for the SEC. We're always going to see cases like that.
Yeah. What is your criminal case of the year?
So my criminal case of the year is the Trillium case, which involved the CEO of Trillium, Scott Murray, essentially claiming that he was going to buy Getty images, right? And he went through this long, protracted set of steps to, I mean, at least according to the SEC and the Department of Justice, to pump up the stock of Getty so that he could then dump it on the market. But the fact pattern is absolutely insane in terms of the steps that this individual allegedly went to try to pump up the stock with mixed results along the way. You kind of read through it and it's like, well, tried this, it didn't work, tried this, worked a little bit, tried this, worked a little, and then sort of was like bingo. But what's also interesting is if you look at the SEC's complaint in that case, it talks a lot about some of Matt Levine's reporting for Bloomberg, because he had, I guess, been writing about this guy for a while before the SEC and DOJ brought their case. And so they talk all about his columns and how, that may or may not have helped them sort of
Yeah.
identify this individual as sort of doing like a fake takeover in
Yeah.
hopes of making a quick buck on the pump and dump.
Interesting. I had a little trouble with this one. I thought it was going to be FTX, but that was actually late 23. I guess
Yeah.
the sentencing of all those execs was in 24. So I'm going to go a little off the grid. I'll go with CZ, the former CEO of Binance and a crypto billionaire, but he pleaded guilty to money laundering or enabling money laundering at Binance and served 4 months in prison. Just got out. He's fresh out. Um, but I'll go with the CZ case.
All right. What's next on our review?
What is the Supreme Court case of the year?
Oh, I mean, there's two, right? So I'll let you go first. Which one do you like better?
I'll take Jarkissi.
Okay.
Um, we won't get into these. Basically, that case kind of either rocked the SEC's AP APs or was the final nail. I don't know how you want to describe it, but basically the case held that when the SEC seek civil penalties against a defendant for securities fraud, the Seventh Amendment entitles a defendant to a jury trial, which is not an administrative proceeding. So,
Yeah. I mean, obviously significant. Again, it was something we talked about with Gabir Graywall on my podcast when he came on in the fall. And his point was, I mean, yes, the staff has been sort of trending away from using APs for a while because there were all these challenges. But once that was finally the law of the land, they had to do a pretty serious rethink internally
yeah.
about how they were going to bring certain types of cases. And he attributed some of the drop off in the enforcement actions to jarczy. And so maybe now what we're seeing with this, report on the phenomenal results in Q1 as a result of them, sort of getting the kinks out, and now things are chugging along again. I don't know, but
I really liked following that podcast. I think Chris had a post on LinkedIn, and he referenced Gerbere and the podcast, and how after giving his disclaimer, Gerbere said this and this, and then Gerbere, as I recall, wrote on LinkedIn, "That's a good name for a podcast, the No Disclaimers Podcast."
oh yeah, that's right.
Which
I
I think
was
is a great idea, and I'm going to steal it or hire him to do one. I don't know if he'll do it, but
You may have to check in with Gabir first. Yeah.
yeah.
No, it's funny because I think he tagged me and Chris in that. And so anytime somebody liked it, I was getting a little ding on my phone. And I was like, man, people are really into this
Yeah.
no disclaimer podcast
The
idea.
No Disclaimer Podcast is genius. Love
I
it.
mean, I love it. I love it. All right. So I guess that leaves me. I'll take on the other one. There were sort of two big Supreme Court cases last year that hit on the SEC. Jarczy was the first one. Loper Bright was the second one. The details there really have nothing to do with the SEC, but the takeaway was that it overturned the Chevron doctrine, which, depending on who you talk to, is either a massive deal because courts no longer have to afford the same amount of deference to agencies that they once did, or no big deal at all because the Supreme Court and many of the appellate courts around the land have not relied on Chevron for years and years and years. I do think, regardless, it is going to cause agencies to do a little bit of a rethink in terms of their
Yeah.
rulemaking and how they're putting out new guidance or regulations from time to time. But really, it's going to be a wait and see. I think Loper Bright maybe just finally said the quiet part out loud with respect to Chevron, but we'll see what the impact is.
Are you seeing any impact in your practice now from either of those, but in particular Loper Bright?
No, I'm really not with Loper Bright. I mean, I'm just thinking back. It's been a while for me since I even thought about a Chevron argument, if I was writing a brief or even, writing something to the SEC. So no, that one hasn't impacted me. Jarczy, yes, in the sense that you now kind of have to think about ways to resolve SEC cases that maybe aren't, it's maybe not the same menu that you would have put on the table, a year or more ago when sort of trying to advise clients on what to do. So it is impacting things in that way.
Yeah. All right, moving on. We're into the home stretch here. What is your book of the year? Now, we're not talking about your favorite, beach reading. We're talking about fraud and
I'm
securities
out. I got nothing, Bruce. So I'm actually going to go. It's not a book that was published in 2024. It's a book that I read in 2024. Will that count for the podcast?
Yes, because I'm going to
Okay.
cheat also on this one.
Okay, awesome. So mine is a book called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke, which actually was published in 2018. I read it at the beginning of last year. So essentially, Annie Duke was a professional poker player. I think she was the first woman to win a World Series of Poker event. Maybe I've got my history wrong, but I think that's right. But the point of the book was to teach you how to get comfortable with uncertainty and make better decisions, which she calls as thinking in bets. And there's like two quotes that I'll just read quickly because I think they encapsulate at least how she thinks about this. So the first one is, quote, "Thinking in bets starts with recognizing that there are exactly two things that determine how our lives turn out: the quality of our decisions and luck. Learning to recognize the difference between the two is what thinking in bets is all about," end quote. And the second one kind of flows from that, quote, "What makes a decision great is not that it has a great outcome. A great decision is the result of a good process. And that process must include an attempt to accurately represent our own state of knowledge. That state of knowledge, in turn, is some variation of I'm not sure, end quote. So, I mean, the book is all about, when you sit down at a poker table, there's an awful lot of strategy involved, but there's also a lot of, I don't know. I don't necessarily know what cards the other player or players have. I can think about probabilities. I can think about, what's in my hand. There's lots of things. There's lots of information that you can gather and sort of put in to your process, as she says. But you have to get comfortable with the unknown and make the best decision you can make based on the information available. So, I mean, just, for me, I thought it was an interesting book and maybe a different way to think about the world, but some practical application for what I do every day, and thinking about how to talk to clients who always want to know, like, what are the percent chance that I'm going to win this, right? Like, where is this likely to fall on a range of potential outcomes? And this has helped me kind of rethink that as I'm calibrating.
That's interesting. I've heard of that book, but I haven't read it, so I'm gonna have to put that on my list.
It's good. It's pretty short too, so it's worth
I'll
reading.
definitely pick that up. All right. So my book of the year is going to be Fool Me Once by Kelly Richmond Pope. You may recognize this book, Kurt. It was actually published in 2023. I heard about it when you interviewed Kelly on
Yeah.
your March 2024 episode of the Insecurities podcast. And I wound up buying 175 copies of the book to give to everybody at the Securities Enforcement Forum Central back in September. So thank you for having her on and introducing me to that book. It was interesting.
Yeah, she's great. I've read it too. It's a phenomenal book. And she was great on the podcast.
Yeah. What is your podcast episode of the year? It doesn't have to be Insecurities podcast.
I specifically did not choose an insecurities episode because I thought, that might just be a little too on the nose. Anyone that knows me knows that I love all things that Michael Lewis does. Huge fan. And for the last couple of
We
years,
might have the same podcast episode, but go on.
all right, interesting. So I listened to, he has a show called Against the Rules, which is now in season 3. And each season sort of has a little bit of a different focus. One was sort of on coaches, one was on umpires and referees. This season actually focuses on sports gambling, or the sports gambling industry in the US. It's fascinating. I highly recommend it. But you said episode, so I'm going to go with episode 9 of season 3 of Against the Rules. And the entire thing is about what he calls the integrity landscape. And what he's really getting at is betting on inside information. Right. So he sends some of his reporters to college campuses to talk to kids who are, tailgating. And it's like all of the kids have their favorite sports betting app on their phone. And they all seem to have somebody like inside on, the football team or the basketball team or whatever it is. And he compares that because obviously Michael Lewis has written a ton about the financial markets and the SEC. He compares it to insider trading. And it's a really fascinating look at sort of when we, society, or when rule makers or regulators think it's okay to have insider information and do something with it, and when it's not. And the sports betting industry has decided it is not. We are going to affirmatively try to root these folks out and get this out of the gambling industry. And it's similar at the SEC, but then there's all kinds of other places where folks do business with inside information all the time. So I found that really interesting because of the overlap.
I'm also a huge Michael Lewis fan. I actually really liked the Going Infinite book that he wrote about FTX. I know it received a lot of
Oh,
criticism.
yeah.
I thought it was amazing.
Yeah.
But my podcast episode of the year was the December 12th, 2024 episode of the Prof G webcast. I don't know if you ever listened to that. It's Scott Galloway.
No.
He's a professor at NYU, I believe. But he had Michael Lewis on to talk about the fall of Sam Bankman-Fried, kind of like a wrap up to the wrap up of the wrap up of everything he had written to that point. And I thought it was really interesting. And selfishly, I liked the November 14th, 24 episode of Insecurities, breaking down Securities Enforcement Forum DC 2024. That was excellent.
Yeah, well, that's always a fun one to do. I think we've done that every year
Yeah.
because it's obviously a great conference and a lot of fun to talk about.
What was your news article or column of the year?
So I'm boring on this one. It's my same answer every year. It's always Matt Levine's column. I think it's fascinating because he's talking about, securities frauds, insider trading. He's got this, running theme of everything is securities fraud. I just love Levine's column. I actually teach at the University of Richmond Law School, and I tell my students to subscribe to it at the beginning of the semester so we can talk about it throughout the year. So I'm going to stick with Matt Levine, again this year.
Yeah, in terms of columnist of the year, 100%. Um, Pretty much every year, in my opinion. I was trying to go after a specific article or column, and I'm going to go with John Stark's December 8th post called 12 Unprecedented SEC Reforms to Expect During the First 100 Days of SEC Chair Paul
Oh,
Atkins.
yeah.
I put a link to it. John's very prolific. When he writes something, he writes it in great detail. And I remember after he wrote it, I emailed him and I said, like, I think you're the only one who either could write this or would write this, because basically it's very difficult to write something like that unless you have vast experience, but also complete independence. If you're working for AmLaw 100 law firm, you don't have the independence to write exactly what you want. And so
Yeah.
I think that was a terrific article, and I'll put the link to it in the show notes.
Yeah, no, I remember when that came out. I always read John's stuff, and that was another good one. But yeah, definitely link to it, folks. You should go read.
Who's your reporter of the year?
So this one's tough because I don't want to upset anybody. But I'm actually going to go with Adam Liptak, who covers the Supreme Court for the New York Times. We had him on the podcast a few months ago. Really enjoyed spending some time with him. But I actually found over the last year his reporting on all the things happening at the Supreme Court to be fascinating, because there were so many cases that touched on, the so-called the administrative state. There was Jargisi, obviously, is right down the middle. Loper Bright less so, but just his take on how those cases would sort of impact the regulatory landscape and the regulators more broadly, I thought was fascinating. Helps that he's a terrific, just a wonderful writer, easy to read. So I'm going to go with Adam Liptak.
I'm going to go with Eleanor Tourette of Fox Business News. Um, I don't believe I'd ever heard of her heading into 2024. And by the end of the year, I feel like I was learning more from her about the SEC than pretty much anybody. So great job, Eleanor, and you're my selection for the year.
Excellent.
Okay, the daily update newsletter has a people section. What was your personnel move of the year?
I actually don't have one, if only because so many people have moved over the last year. I mean, I think it's typical in a year where there's a changeover to a new administration. You see folks start to come out, and a lot of the senior officers at the SEC have already announced their departures. So I don't want to pick one friend or another. So
Right.
I'll leave that to you, Bruce.
All right. Well, I think it's got to be Gerbir Graywall leaving the SEC at the end of the year and going to Milbank. I mean, there's not a whole lot of movement of enforcement directors, and we had that at the end of the year. So
Yeah,
I'll go with uh, Gerbir Graywall.
that's a good one.
Finally, this isn't really a competition or anything, but I just wanted, sometimes at the end of the award shows, they have an in memoriam type of thing. Um, one in particular that I wanted to point out was the passing of Roberta Carmel. She was the first female SEC commissioner in the SEC's history. She served from 1977 to 1980. She was on the staff prior to that. She was a lawyer in private practice for like 30 years at Wilkie Farr and other law firms where there weren't a lot of women. And then, ultimately she was a pretty prominent securities law commentator and professor at Brooklyn Law School. So I'll go with I'd like to mention her. I have an interesting Roberta Carmel story though. So I'd never met her, but about 10 years ago we did this Hall of Fame for securities enforcement for Securities Docket, and there
Mhm.
were 6 or 7 people on it, including like Stan Sporkin and Bill McLucas and a lot of other luminaries, and Roberta Carmel was on that. And so at the event, we had like an award ceremony where we handed out like kind of Hall of Fame commemorative
Mhm.
things. And most everybody was there, but Roberta Carmel wasn't there. And I thought she was coming. And the next morning after the event, I woke up, I was checking out of the hotel, and I saw a woman in the lobby, and I kind of recognized her from the photo that I had seen for the award. And I said, Roberta? And she said, yeah. And I said, how are you? I didn't see you last night. And she was like, I just got here. And I said, well, the event was last night. And she said, there had been a miscommunication somehow, and she had the
Yeah.
date wrong. And I said, well, do you want to go have lunch? And so we went and had lunch for about an hour. And, she's just absolutely lovely and charming person. And, it was kind of an honor to be able to sit with her and have
Yeah.
lunch.
Yeah. No, that's really nice. I met her a couple times too at different conferences, only in passing, but I had the same impression. She just was lovely, very approachable, incredibly nice and gracious with her time. So I think that's a great in memoriam to close out the show.
Yeah. All right. Well, any last thoughts on 2024 before we head into the new year?
No, I mean, I think we've covered a lot, and some respects, 2024 may end up being a little bit forgettable for an awful lot of reasons. Even Jarkissi and Loper Bright, we don't know how impactful they're actually going to be. So I am fully focused now going forward. What does 2025 have to hold for the SEC and the Division of Enforcement?
It'll be a very interesting year, no doubt. So, Kurt, thanks again for your time today, for your thoughts. That was really fun.
Yeah,
I will see you in New York on January 28th for Securities Enforcement Forum New York. So, thanks again. We'll talk soon.
yeah, I'm looking forward to it. See you soon.